The fact that we continue to sustain them with money means that we are paying for the Ukrainian military, what's left of it. We are paying the Ukrainian government, and we have lost tens of billions of dollars, much of which is probably residing in banks in places like Cyprus or Albania or elsewhere in the world, because Ukraine is probably one of the most corrupt, if not the most corrupt country in the world. We don't know how many tens of thousands of children and women have disappeared from Ukraine as a result of human trafficking, but the whole thing is nothing less than a horror show. We are not in any position now to challenge the Russians for control of Ukraine, period, let alone eastern Ukraine. Their force is far larger, better equipped, better trained, obviously better led than our own forces. NATO is a collection of cats. Think of a herd of cats and how difficult it is to herd cats. That's NATO. NATO is a very complex, very diverse group of people, and the overwhelming majority want nothing to do with a war against Russia.
This is a blunt and scathing assessment of the current situation in Ukraine, the financial support from the West, and the role of NATO. To fully understand the depth of Macgregor's message, we need to break this down into a few key components. First, let's talk about the money. Since the start of the war, the United States and its allies have poured billions of dollars into Ukraine. These funds are meant to support Ukraine's military, provide humanitarian aid, and keep the Ukrainian government afloat. However, as Macgregor pointed out, Ukraine has long been plagued by corruption, and there are serious questions about where all of this money is actually going. Ukraine's corruption problems are not new. Transparency International consistently ranks Ukraine as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and even before the war, there were widespread concerns about oligarchs and government officials siphoning off foreign aid for their own personal gain. Now, in the chaos of war, it's even harder to track where the money is going. Billions of dollars have been allocated, but much of it could very well be sitting in offshore bank accounts in places like Cyprus or Albania. So, while Western governments and taxpayers continue to funnel money into Ukraine, the question remains: how much of that money is actually being used to support the war effort, and how much is simply disappearing into the pockets of corrupt officials? Then there's the issue of human trafficking. Macgregor briefly mentioned the disappearance of tens of thousands of women and children, a tragic consequence of the war that hasn't received nearly enough attention in the media. In times of conflict, human trafficking often increases dramatically, and Ukraine is no exception. The war has displaced millions of people, creating a vulnerable population that is at high risk for exploitation. Traffickers prey on refugees, especially women and children, offering them false promises of safety or work, only to force them into slavery, prostitution, or other forms of exploitation. While precise numbers are difficult to come by, the reports that have surfaced suggest that the scale of human trafficking in Ukraine is staggering. This is yet another horror of this war, one that rarely makes it into the headlines. While Western governments focus on sending military aid to Ukraine, there is far less attention being paid to the humanitarian crisis, including the rampant human trafficking that's taking place under the cover of war. Now, let's talk about the state of the Ukrainian military and the overall strategic situation. Macgregor paints a grim picture. He argues that the Ukrainian military has been essentially destroyed, and what remains is being propped up entirely by Western aid. But even with this support, he believes Ukraine has no chance of reclaiming its lost territory, let alone defeating Russia. The Russians, Macgregor argues, have built a far larger, better equipped, and better led force. Throughout the conflict, Russia has been able to mobilize its military reserves and adjust its tactics, while Ukraine has been heavily reliant on foreign aid and NATO support. Despite this assistance, Ukraine has struggled to match Russia's military capabilities on the battlefield. And here's where NATO comes into the picture. Macgregor describes NATO as a herd of cats, a metaphor that captures the difficulty of coordinating such a diverse alliance. NATO is made up of 31 countries, each with its own political priorities, economic concerns, and military capabilities. While the alliance has shown unity in supporting Ukraine, there are deep divisions within NATO over how far to go in confronting Russia directly. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states are deeply concerned about Russian aggression and have been vocal advocates for more military aid to Ukraine. On the other hand, nations like Germany and France have been more cautious, fearing that a direct confrontation with Russia could lead to a wider war that would devastate Europe. Macgregor's point is clear. NATO is not a unified force that's ready to take on Russia in a direct war. In fact, most NATO members want to avoid that outcome at all costs. This complicates the situation for Ukraine, which has been counting on NATO's support to resist Russian advances. But as Macgregor sees it, the idea that NATO will come to Ukraine's rescue in any meaningful way is simply unrealistic. This brings us to the larger question of NATO's role in global security. In the wake of the Cold War, NATO expanded rapidly, taking in former Eastern Bloc countries and pushing its borders ever closer to Russia. For years, this expansion was seen as a way to promote stability in Europe and deter Russian aggression. But as Macgregor suggests, NATO's expansion may have overextended the alliance's capabilities. The reality is that NATO's member states have very different military capacities. The United States accounts for the vast majority of NATO's military spending, with countries like the UK and France contributing significantly less. Meanwhile, many European countries, especially in Western Europe, have allowed their militaries to atrophy, focusing instead on domestic priorities. This has created a situation where NATO is more of a political alliance than a cohesive military force. Yes, NATO can mobilize forces in an emergency, and the United States remains a powerful military actor, but the idea of NATO launching a full-scale war against Russia is far-fetched. As Macgregor points out, the majority of NATO members want nothing to do with such a conflict, and for good reason. A war with Russia would be catastrophic for Europe, both militarily and economically. Another important aspect to consider is the economic cost to the West. The billions of dollars that have been sent to Ukraine aren't just numbers on a page. This is real money, taken from Western taxpayers and diverted from other pressing domestic needs. While politicians in Washington and Brussels talk about the need to support Ukraine, there's growing frustration among ordinary people who see their own countries struggling with inflation, energy crises, and social unrest. In the United States, for example, many Americans are questioning why so much money is being sent overseas when there are serious problems at home. Infrastructure is crumbling, healthcare costs are rising, and the education system is underfunded. Yet, billions continue to flow into Ukraine, with no end in sight. And what's the return on this investment? According to Macgregor, the war is effectively lost. Ukraine is not going to defeat Russia, no matter how much money the West throws at the problem. Instead, the conflict is dragging on, draining resources from the West and prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people. So, what happens next? If Macgregor is right, and Ukraine is in no position to challenge Russia, what's the endgame? One possibility is a negotiated settlement, but that would likely require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia, something that President Zelensky and his government have been unwilling to consider. However, as the war drags on and Ukraine's military is further degraded, there may be no other option. For the West, the challenge will be how to manage the fallout from this conflict. If Ukraine is forced to negotiate a settlement that favors Russia, it will be seen as a major defeat for NATO and Western foreign policy. The credibility of the United States and its allies will be called into question, and there will likely be political repercussions, both at home and abroad. Colonel Douglas Macgregor has painted a stark picture of the realities on the ground in Ukraine. From rampant corruption to the horrifying toll of human trafficking, to the inability of NATO to effectively confront Russia, the situation is dire. As we look to the future, one thing is certain. The war in Ukraine will have far-reaching consequences, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for Europe, the United States, and the world as a whole. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, keep questioning the narrative, and seek out the truth. According to Douglas Macgregor, the fact that we continue to sustain them with money means that we are paying for the Ukrainian military what's left of it. We are paying the Ukrainian government, and we have lost tens of billions of dollars, much of which is probably residing in banks in places like Cyprus or Albania or elsewhere in the world because Ukraine is probably one of the most corrupt, if not the most corrupt country in the world. We don't know how many tens of thousands of children and women have disappeared from Ukraine as a result of human trafficking. But the whole thing is nothing less than a horror show. We are not in any position now to challenge the Russians for control of Ukraine, period. Let alone Eastern Ukraine. Their forces are far larger, better equipped, better trained, and obviously better led than our own forces. NATO is a collection of cats. Think of a herd of cats and how difficult it is to herd cats. That's NATO. NATO is a very complex, very diverse group of people, and the overwhelming majority want nothing to do with a war against Russia. Thanks for watching.